Well, good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a splendid show for you today. It is Tuesday morning, lots of news to get to, and I am joined by my friend Niall Stanage. Nice to see you, Niall.
A pleasure to see you, Robbie. The last time I saw you, you were wearing a bow tie, which I'm disappointed you haven't continued on to Tuesday morning. But,
and as I conceded, I did not tie it myself. It was a clip-on. I couldn't do it, man. It was too frickin' hard.
Take the convenient option, Robbie. It's always the best option. On a more serious note, what is in your radar today?
Well, actually a reaction to that dinner we attended over the weekend, Niall. Mainstream media figures so very proud of themselves for admitting their own errors with respect to the buried story of President Joe Biden's cognitive decline. But one person who isn't letting them off the hook so easily is White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, who tore into the White House Correspondents Dinner guests on Monday. Now, as I discussed yesterday during my radar, one of the awardees at the Saturday Correspondents' Dinner, which, by the way, I attended, as did Niall, was Axios' Alex Thompson, who did important work exposing Biden's diminishing abilities and was one of the mainstream journalists who did eventually raise questions about whether Biden was up for the job, whether he should be running for another term, whether he would be actually able to serve for another 4 years. At the dinner, Thompson accepted his award and made brief remarks. He did inform the gathered journalists that their collective failure to report on Biden's decline and helped erode trust in media, and that it's important for them to admit their mistake. The room received these remarks with applause after he said it. Now, Leavitt was asked at Monday's press briefing about Thompson's speech. Here was her response.
I do agree with that assessment from Alex Thompson, who I understand won an award for writing a story months and perhaps years after the American people already knew that story to be true. Millions of Americans watched our mentally incompetent president struggle with his day-to-day duties of this office. We watched our country be ran into the ground as a result, and nobody in the media wanted to write about that, talk about it. There were many reporters, I will say, right-leaning reporters who did talk about that, who didn't get awards, didn't get coverage. In fact, they were lambasted for their coverage. And I remember being on President Trump's campaign, talking about Joe Biden's clear mental incompetence and being accused by people in this room of manufacturing deep fake videos, trying to persuade the public into not believing what they saw with their own eyes for many years. And I think it's about time the legacy media finally admits that was one of the greatest cover-ups and scandals that ever took place in American history, and certainly it did contribute to the decline in the trust that Americans have for the legacy media. Peter, which, by the way, is why we've made many changes to this briefing room in this White House. It's long overdue. Peter.
Leavitt has a point. Alternative, contrarian, and conservative media had been asking probing questions about Biden's fitness long before this became a topic of interest to the mainstream media. But conservatives just didn't have the same level of access to Biden that the MSM did, which was a huge problem. As Leavitt points out, the Trump administration has worked to correct this and now includes in press briefings tons of conservatives and alternative media figures and influencers, particularly those who work in new media. The mainstream media has certainly noticed the presence of these figures, whom they view essentially as interlopers. In reporting on Leavitt's inclusive policies, the New York Times made a handy chart of all the new faces in the new media seat, characteristically describing the new media ventures with mainstream sensibilities in neutral terms and characterizing the conservative ones as, well, conservative. Now, while I welcome Leavitt's changes to the press briefing room, I will say this. I've noticed these press briefings are increasingly becoming opportunities for pro-Trump influencers to, instead of asking questions, essentially grandstand and own the libs, which really isn't the point of all this, as much as I may find it amusing. Conservative journalists and independent content creators should use their increased access to ask the hard-hitting questions that the mainstream media won't ask, or else they'll just be replicating the very kinds of softball questions routinely they rightly deride the mainstream media for succumbing to. Remember, the problem is not the media being too mean or too unfair to poor old Donald Trump. The press is supposed to be adversarial to the president. The problem is the media being too deferential to the man in charge when they approve of his actions, or more likely, when they fear that negative coverage of him would be a boon to Trump. That's what really went wrong in this whole cognitive decline story. The media has given the people the impression they didn't want to ask uncomfortable questions because they realized that doing so, that exposing the central truth that Biden could scarcely serve out his term, let alone be the president until 2028, would make a second Trump presidency inevitable. But the truth matters. Having failed to suppress it, the media is now dealing with the reality of a second Trump presidency, and an environment of absolutely rock bottom levels of trust in the mainstream media. Let's please hold the applause. So you're an occasional visitor to the White House press briefing room.
Yes.
What do you make of the recent changes to it?
I don't like the recent changes to it. That perhaps won't surprise you, but not because I regard them as interlopers, to use your word, because I regard them as bootlickers and grovelers. Some of the questions that have been asked have been absurdly soft, and this does get to your point. The purpose of journalism, or the appropriate stance of journalism, is to at least be skeptical of those in power. And what we see from some of these new people who are in that briefing room is an absolute unctuousness toward those in power. There was one instance fairly recently when the correspondent for Lindell TV, Mike Lindell's outlet, asked Karoline Leavitt whether you guys...
Your only source for pillow-related news.
Well, exactly. He's the man with the pillow. She asked the White House press secretary whether you guys would consider releasing the president's fitness plan. He actually looks healthier than ever before. That is not by any stretch an appropriate or useful or journalistically valid thing to ask someone who has enormous power.
Well, I think without the rhetorical flurry, without the editorializing that, man, does he look beautiful in like a North Korean sense, but I think asking for his fitness regimen might be a fine thing to do.
I don't think you can strip one context from the other, though. I mean, the question was inherently about telling the press secretary how fantastic the president was looking. Look,
but the point is, they could. I agree with you, but they could be using this opportunity to ask questions, and some people are, to ask questions that the mainstream media, even from a less like like anti-them, just wouldn't occur to them to ask. Like I mean, there's this argument going on the right. There's actual ideological disagreement about foreign policy, about some aspects of the culture wars, about economics for sure. So to add, well, Trump said he was going to do this, but these people in the administration want to do this. What does he think? Like, there is interesting questions you can ask from the conservative perspective. This isn't really my issue or my view, but for instance, more religious social conservatives could be asking about, what about is there a changing prioritization of abortion issues, the pro-life cause, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Again, that wouldn't be my question, but you could have somebody who writes for a pro-life social conservative news site getting at them on that question. I think that would be a perfectly fine use of their time. That'd be good.
I agree, and I would also agree it is unlikely that the New York Times or the Associated Press or I would ask that question. So that, I think, is fair enough. What I find, though, peculiar about the broader picture here is the point of view that you put forward, and that I agree with, that it is the job of the press to be adversarial. I'm just not sure how many people believe that anymore, and there seems to be a real market for just cheerleading. And a classic example of this in the new media seat recently was Tim Pool, the podcaster, who, to my amazement, was hailed for his courage in asking a question that just invited Karoline Leavitt to say how unfair the press coverage of Trump was and how much nicer it should be. That is a view that a private individual can hold, but as a question, the idea that it is courageous to serve up softballs to those at the center of power just seems ludicrous to me.
Needs absolutely no assistance in skewering or intellectual adversaries or the Democrats or the media. She is very good at it and didn't need any assistance on that front.
Well, that may be so. I just find it entirely bizarre that these kind of smarmy questions get hailed for their courage. There is no courage at all in cozying up to those in power.
But of course, we wonder why the reason there is this declining trust in the mainstream media is the perception that they didn't ask, or they asked the questions eventually, took them too long, and then didn't really get to the bottom of it until it was so glaringly obvious on the Biden front.
There are things that the mainstream media covered badly or imperfectly, and I would never deny that. I think that the way you just framed the question there, though, underplays the fact that there are people who, for either political or financial reasons, have worked to delegitimize the mainstream media for bad faith reasons in order to further a political agenda or financial gain.
All right, today marks Trump's 100th day in office. Niall will dig into that. You'll hear from Niall's notes coming up next.